through December 5th, and Mr. Gingrey of Georgia for today and the balance of the week.
Without objection, the requests are granted. The Chair will now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend the remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the President has taken an oath to uphold the Constitution, but this President has refused to follow and enforce certain laws. He doesn't enforce all immigration laws. He doesn't enforce the mandatory minimum punishments. He doesn't enforce the work requirement for welfare recipients. He doesn't enforce the marijuana laws. He illegally made recess appointments. He illegally changed Obamacare by postponing implementation for big business, small business, and individuals, and granting arbitrary waivers to special people. He unconstitutionally took America to war in Libya. All of these actions are unilateral, unlawful, and unconstitutional. The Constitution requires the President to execute and enforce law, not create his own laws, ignore the rule of law. However, this President, the former constitutional law professor, seems to think the Constitution is a mere suggestion and he will do as he pleases. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? I stand corrected. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to pay tribute to a woman who is considered the modern mother of the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks. This past Sunday, we celebrated the 58th anniversary of Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on that bus in Montgomery, Alabama. I am so proud to stand here from the great state of Ohio, because it was the great state of Ohio that was the first state in this nation to name December 1st Rosa Parks Day. On Thursday and Friday of this week in our district, we will bring people from all over the state to pay tribute to her. And we will bring in more than 600 little children who will learn about civil rights and understand the value of working together. The last day, 1955, she started something larger than herself. She sat down so we could stand up. Mr. Speaker, it is my honor to be a part of the legislation that created December 1st in Ohio as Rosa Parks Day. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
To address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Medicare Advantage provides quality coverage to many seniors in western Pennsylvania. It is popular because it provides more options and increased care coordination. Until 2011, seniors were able to take advantage of an annual open enrollment period from January through March and make adjustments if the plan they chose did not meet their needs. Unfortunately, the Affordable Care Act eliminated this option. The Wall Street Journal recently reported that one of the nation's largest Medicare Advantage providers had dropped thousands of doctors from its network. As a result, seniors may be unsure about whether they need to switch plans to continue seeing their doctors when the current open enrollment period ends this Saturday. This uncertainty underscores the importance of the Medicare Beneficiary Preservation of Choice Act, H.R. 2453, which Congressman Kurt Schrader and I introduced earlier this year. This bill would restore seniors' freedom to try their plans and make changes. I thank my 13 Republican and Democrat colleagues for joining me in advocating for our seniors, and I encourage members on both sides of the aisle to support this common sense and bipartisan legislation. I thank the Speaker, and I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman who seeks recognition. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? The gentleman is without objection. The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I've risen before to talk about the fact that the congressional district that I represent has the highest uninsured rate out of any congressional district in the entire country. About 40% of the constituents that I represent don't have health care insurance. And I wanted to talk today about how the Affordable Health Care Act is already helping many of those constituents in the very district that I represent. Yesterday I found out that a constituent who resides in the district I represent, Jason Roberts, had suffered from cancer and that he had been running out of options. But when the Affordable Health Care Act kicked in, he found out that his COBRA benefits would be saved. Because of the options offered through the Affordable Care Act, Jason, who again had suffered from cancer, he actually dropped his monthly premiums by $251 and his deductible by $1,500. And that's an overall savings of about $4,500 a year for what Jason describes as great coverage. The simple fact that he and so many others are actually able to keep their insurance, even if they have a pre-existing condition like Jason had with cancer, is a true testament to the benefits of the health care law. Let's work together to make sure that this health care law works for all of the uninsured like Jason, and that it continues to work for all Americans. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I request the Minister to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, I was joined by my colleagues in sending a letter to Secretary of State Kerry to express concern about a potential interim agreement with Iran. 2 weeks ago, such a deal was reached. It is a bad deal. The world rolls back sanctions without Iran fully dismantling its nuclear weapons program. Sanctions have impacted Iran's economy, leading its people to elect a less confrontational president. This recent political shift, in addition to pressure from sanctions, drove Iran to the negotiating table. Regardless, the Ayatollah, the real power in Iran, continues spewing hateful language at Israel and the West. Now is not the time to ease sanctions that have been effective for a mere promise that Iran's nuclear weapons program will be temporarily suspended. The sanctions' intent was to prevent a nuclear Iran. Anything less than the complete dismantling of its nuclear weapons program is unacceptable. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Permission to speak for 1 minute on the floor, please.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The U.S. motion picture and television industry has broad economic benefits in many districts across the nation. This vibrant industry supported 1.9 million jobs and $104 billion in total wages in 2011. U.S. film exports enjoy a positive trade balance with a surplus of $12.2 billion recorded in 2011. However, theft of intellectual property threatens our industry's success, and India is a major source of that threat. India accounts for more than half of all illegal movie recordings in the Asia-Pacific region. These pirated copies are sold online and on the black market, not only in India but around the globe. India's irresponsible policies need to change. They need to pass anti-camcording laws. We want to share our on-screen treasures with the world, but we can't stand by and let them be stolen at the expense of the hard-working Americans who bring these films to life. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Permission to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For 14 years, Bill Rickett was the man who kept Bucks County moving. Mr. Rickett served since 1999 as the founding executive director for the Bucks County Transportation Management Association, and under Bill's leadership, the Bucks County TMA successfully completed a number of projects to improve transportation access and mobility throughout the area, including connecting commuters to regional rail service by shuttle and improvements to the Route 13 corridor in Lower Bucks County, as well as many others. Aside from his service at the TMA, Mr. Rickett worked with community organizations to make Bucks County a better place to live and to work, including serving on boards of both the Bucks County Lower Bucks Chamber of Commerce and the Development Advisory Board of the Bucks County Enterprise Zone. Thanks to his efforts, Bucks County continues to find new and innovative ways to enhance the quality of life for its residents. On behalf of his co-workers in a grateful county, I want to thank Mr. Rickett and wish him nothing but the best in his well-deserved retirement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Permission to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the great pleasures of serving on the Defense Committee is that we get to be associated with a large number of people who are in the armed services. And one such acquaintance and friend is Major Tom E. Lamb. Tom Lamb is the Congressional Budget Liaison for the Army to the Appropriations Committee. Does an excellent job in that capacity. He was also the military fellow in our office and got to know the good folks in South Georgia and our staff, and we all grew to love Tom. And I'm going to submit for the record a number of things about Tom's life, but I've got to tell one story about him. And you, Mr. Speaker, as a member of the military will appreciate this, but we were traveling in a remote part of the world and had to make an unexpected stop because of a weather delay in our travel and had to get into a dirt runway on a particular in a particular location, and then we had to split up the group because of a weight problem and weather problem and just complications. So one of Tom's duties was to reassign people on a new and a different airplane, and it was a smaller airplane. And he was having trouble getting everybody on board because of the weight issue. And finally, I said to Tom, what is the problem? I'm counting up the number of seats, and there should be enough room. And he said, sir, we have to go by weight, and I've asked each member of Congress what their weight is, and sir, not everybody has given me their accurate weight. And so I'm having to do a little bit of balancing and avoid embarrassment to everybody. And it was just amazing to me that here's this guy, a military officer, an Iraqi and an Afghan veteran, and yet he had the aplomb and the diplomacy to handle a situation like this with a smile, with humor, and get us out of this location by splitting up everybody and not causing any turmoil or friction. And that's just a small example of the kind of things that today's military leaders can do, and I know there were a lot bigger issues that he dealt with when he was in Iraq and Afghanistan, and indeed working in the budget office. I've worked with him on lots and lots of different issues, but Tom Lamb, to me, Mr. Speaker, represents the finest in the military and the finest in the United States of America. I wish Tom and his wife Emily the best in their next duty assignment. Tom, thank you for all the great service you've given the United States government, the Congress, and our office in particular.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to memorialize a friend who just passed away recently here in Northern California. I knew her from Paradise, California. Her name is Hazel Reed. Everybody referred to her as Hayes, and that's kind of part of the fun of who she was. I know she enjoyed visiting our ranch on occasion and was always very active in her community with political type issues and standing up for the freedom and values that this country was founded on. And so I always appreciated her greatly for her spirit, her feistiness, and that she would take that time out of her life to be involved in the political process and, more importantly, standing up for community and its values. So, again, I'm happy to, at least at this day, memorialize her, though we will miss her. Hazel Reed, known as Hayes, from Paradise, California. So, God bless her. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there anyone else seeking recognition for 1 minute? Hearing none. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2013, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Roscom, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials in the subject of this special order.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, there's hinge points in history. There's times at which you can sense that history is moving almost on a hinge from one trajectory to another trajectory, and my sense and my observation is that the United States is experiencing such a hinge right now. Okay, what's the hinge? What's the change? What's going on? Here's what's happening. The administration has made a decision that is moving subtly in some ways, but I think the results are going to be very, very consequential, and the subtleties will be lost, and we're going to be at a very different position. In other words, the hinge will move us from our current policy, which says that Iran shall not be a nuclear power. That is the stated position of the United States. It's unambiguous. There's no ambiguity about that, at least not up until now. But the hinge that is changing is a direction that begins to say, well, maybe not. Maybe instead we need a policy of containment. And that's a very dangerous direction, Mr. Speaker. That's a direction that we ought not go. It's a direction, unfortunately, that the Obama administration is leading us right now, and I'm convinced it's a mistake. The House of Representatives has a responsibility as part of a co-equal branch of government. We have worked, we have passed sanctions that are robust and dynamic, that aren't taken up by the false claim of the Iranians, a false promise of future conduct. We need our colleagues on the other side of the rotunda to take on a very rigorous sanctions bill and to push back very, very aggressively, because here's the thing. The Iranians are allowed to enrich under this proposed deal. There's no investigation as it relates to the warheads. There's no investigation as it relates to their missile capacity. And so what's happening? The Iranians gain an advantage of time and money, and we squander both. This is a time when the United States needs to be clear and not ambiguous. So there's members who are gathered here today, Mr. Speaker, to talk about the seriousness of this issue, to admonish the administration and encourage them to change course, and we hope to highlight the significant nature of this shift in American foreign policy that we're seeing lay out before us as we speak. So toward that end, I would be honored at this point to recognize my colleague and friend, the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. The political pundits are all focused on, was this a good deal, was this a bad deal? That we're not here in Congress to give a grade to the administration. We're here in Congress to decide what legislation should be passed. Congress is a policy-making body, although so often those in the administration think that we are at most advisors or critics. But let's take a look at this deal, and we'll see that what we get out of it is at least overstated by its proponents. Because we are told that this halts their enrichment of uranium. It is true that it limits their 20% uranium. And Iran will not be making progress during the 6-month period of this deal toward its first bomb. But they will be making very substantial progress toward their 8th, 9th, and 10th bomb. And Iran is not a nuclear power until they have some to hide, 1 or 2 to test. It is not their objective to have but 1. Because throughout this agreement, it is very clear, the centrifuges keep spinning. The amount of low-enriched uranium keeps growing. But we're told that Iran will not be increasing its stockpile. If you read the agreement, yes, they will. But they have to convert to uranium oxide metal that which they produce during the term of this agreement. There are some proponents of the agreement that says, well, that means they're neutralizing all that they produce under the agreement. That is hardly true. I've been the chair or ranking member of the Terrorism and Nonproliferation Subcommittee since it was created in the early part of this century. And I've worked with the non-proliferation experts. The fact is that this uranium oxide, this huge new additional stockpile to be created over the next 6 months, can be converted back to gaseous form and then enriched further, and converting it back to gaseous form will take only a couple of weeks. So this agreement provides that Iran makes substantial progress toward more low-enriched uranium, building its stockpile toward a real collection of nuclear bombs. We are also told that we've given up very little in this agreement. We have given up far more than you can find in the text, because the most important thing about our sanctions is momentum. And we passed additional sanctions in 2010, 2011, 2012, and if it hadn't been for this agreement, the Senate would have passed the bill that we worked on in the summer, and we would have passed additional sanction in 2013. The content of those sanctions is important, but even more important is the momentum. If you're a multinational corporation, you can find a law firm that will find loopholes in our existing sanctions. But you'll decide not to invest a lot into that business plan because you know Congress is going to pass more sanctions. Well, now you know we're not passing any sanctions in 2013. And the question before us as legislators is whether we'll be passing sanctions in 2014. Why is momentum so important? Not just to those international businesses trying to decide whether to invest in exploiting the loopholes. Most of economics is psychology. It's currency values, it's consumers' confidence, it's business confidence, it's investment. And we saw the celebrations in Tehran as the business community celebrated this agreement because it ends the continuing momentum toward additional sanctions. But we're not here again to grade the administration. That's for pollsters and pundits. We're here to decide whether to pass legislation. It is very clear we're not going to pass legislation that becomes effective in 2013. The question before us is whether we'll pass legislation which, by its terms, becomes effective June 1st, 2014. And the reason the administration sent some of its top officials to brief us in a classified briefing today is because they want to convince us not to take any action in the first 5 or 6 months of 2014. Well, what does that mean? That means, in effect, we are not going to take action in 2014. Why is that? Most people think that this deal expires in late May, 6 months after it was adopted in November 24th, 2013. That's not the case. The start date is someday to be determined, sometime probably in late January. So if we as a Congress are convinced not to take any action, not to pass any legislation, not to go through the committee process and the markup until after this agreement has terminated, we're talking about late July. Well, at the end of July, we go on break. We come back for, 2 or 3 weeks between then and the November elections. So if the administration can convince us to not do anything until 6 months after the trigger date, which is a date to be determined sometime in January, they can assure the Iranians that no new sanctions will be adopted in 2014. And that will be apparent to those doing business in Iran and those doing business with Iran. The administration complimented us more than once, saying these sanctions are what brought Iran to the table. But let us remember that the administration opposed the adoption of these sanctions every single time. The reason we did not adopt any sanctions against Iran in 2009 was opposition from the administration and the tremendous intellectual clout and credibility that the State Department administration bring. But it's not just this administration. We didn't pass any sanctions during the entire 8 years of the prior administration. Oh, we passed some through the House, but they stopped them in the Senate, and with considerable effort. Not one bill became law. So we've seen 2 administrations that do their best to delay and dilute and prevent. Delay, dilute, and defeat sanctions legislation. And so now they say, isn't it great we have this legislation? but don't pass any new legislation, let us remember they were against the legislation they now say is so great. The best example of this is the Kirk-Menendez Amendment in 2011. That was the bill that prevented Iran's central bank from clearing their petroleum dollar-denominated transactions through the American banking system. Well, what did the administration say in the form of a letter from Secretary Geithner? He wrote in December 1st, 2011, I am writing to express the administration's strong opposition to this amendment. It threatens to undermine effective sanctions. In addition, the amendment would potentially yield a net economic benefit to the Iranian regime. There's only one reason Iran is at the table today. It's because of the sanctions we've adopted over the last 3 years, and the most important of those was the Menendez-Kirk sanctions that the administration fought against. What we ought to do is to adopt legislation providing additional sanctions, and we've already written them. We passed the bill in June with 400 votes on this floor. Have those sanctions, and I would think others, go into effect on June 1st unless Congress, in an expedited proceeding, passes a resolution saying, hold off. We've seen enough progress. These sanctions don't need to go into force. Instead, and the other choice, we can do nothing on the theory that we'll do the right thing in the last few days of July, as if Congress turns on a dime, as if the State Department has been unsuccessful in delaying, defeating, and diluting sanctions in the past. That, I think, would be a mistake. With that, I think I've used quite a bit of the gentleman's time. I would point out that this deal calls for a rollback of sanctions that violates American law in a number of respects. It will not be the first time that an administration has refused to enforce the sanctions bills passed by Congress. I will say this administration from 2010 through 2013 has done a much better job of enforcing such legislation than either of the prior two administrations. But as a technical matter, the administration has agreed to waive that which the law does not allow it to waive, particularly Section 504, and I'll go into the details on some other forum. I yield back to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman for his insight and for his leadership on this important issue, and particularly as highlighting the timing, Mr. Speaker, and that it is an illusion to think that, as the gentleman said, this all turns on a dime on the 1st of June. With that, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson.
Mr. Speaker, the nuclear deal agreed upon with Iran is shameful. There's no better example of this than Iran's announcement just days after the agreement was reached to open a new nuclear plant that is not even subject to IAEA inspection. Any nuclear deal must include swift and decisive action that forces Iran to completely abandon its crusade to acquire nuclear weapons capability. We must not give a dangerous regime with a penchant for terrorism and extremism the capability to build a weapon before the world can react. A nuclear-equipped Iran is the most dangerous threat to Israel in the world and to the stability of the Middle East. Indeed, Iran with a nuclear weapons capability is a direct threat to the United States. Mr. Speaker, negotiations like this require serious discussions about our foreign policy in the Middle East, not a reckless decision by President Obama that weakens our national security, that threatens our allies, and lacks the support of this Congress and, frankly, the American people. Reducing sanctions now merely rewards bad behavior and fundamentally halts the progress we've already made. Indeed, instead of reducing our influence and taking steps backwards, we must pursue every avenue to ensure that Iran does not engage in nuclear weapons proliferation and, most importantly, does not develop a nuclear weapon. The only suitable agreement is one that starts with Iran ending their uranium enrichment program. Otherwise, we should not loosen sanctions on this bad actor. I thank you for the time, and I yield back to the gentleman.
Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn.
Representative Peter Roskam, a leader on the U.S.-Israel relationship here in Congress. He and I are two of the co-chairs of the Republican-Israel Caucus. And I share with many colleagues on both sides of the aisle deep concern over the interim agreement that this administration has reached with Iran over its nuclear program. We have struck a deal that irreversibly weakens sanctions against a country that is infamous for its deception and deceit, a deal that does nothing about the infrastructure of its nuclear program. In the weeks since the accord was announced, we already see the first signs how these sanctions, which are what brought Iran to the negotiating table in the first place, are being eroded by other countries eager to resume trade with Iran, as many of us predicted. Weakening the sanctions now without demanding that Iran dismantle its nuclear program takes away our leverage. They have not stopped a single one of its 19,000 centrifuges from enriching uranium. They are not dismantling its plutonium plant either, a plant which has absolutely no peaceful civilian purpose. We are witnessing a recurrence of the kind of effort that failed to prevent North Korea from acquiring nuclear weapons, but in an even more volatile and dangerous region of the world. All this is being done with the country that our own State Department has long defined as the chief state sponsor of international terrorism and which is determined to get nuclear weapons. By giving up our leverage in return for a flawed interim agreement, we are only reducing the chances that a productive accord can ever be reached with Iran over its nuclear program, where Iran actually renounces its right to enrich uranium. I thank the gentleman, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my good friend and colleague from the great state of Illinois, Mr. Roskam, for leading this special order on a very important subject. We have concerns. We should have concerns over a deal with Iran, especially as Americans. It wasn't too long ago where President Clinton told us that North Korea would abide by a similar deal. They agreed to stop their nuclear ambitions in order to get sanctions lifted and get billions in aid from the United States, but they went ahead and secretly continued their program. I caution this administration and the American people to make sure that this doesn't happen again with Iran. This interim deal allows Iran to continue enriching uranium to a 5% purity level and to keep building new centrifuges to repair old ones. It calls for Iran to convert 20% of enriched uranium either to fuel or to a diluted 5% stock, but these processes can easily be reversed, especially since this interim deal does not force Iran to disassemble the infrastructure that allowed it to produce enriched uranium in the first place. A nuclear Iran is a grave danger to our friend and greatest ally in the Middle East, the State of Israel, the rest of our allies throughout the world, and our own American foreign policy interests. As Henry Kissinger noted in the Wall Street Journal, the heart of the problem is Iran's construction of massive nuclear infrastructure and stockpile of enriched uranium far out of proportion to any plausible civilian energy production. I am very concerned that this interim deal does not address the issues at hand, and furthermore, easing sanctions as part of the interim deal causes us to lose leverage at the negotiating table. As many of my colleagues have already mentioned, it's these sanctions that brought them to the negotiating table, and we cannot lose sight of their effectiveness. I actually happen to agree with my colleagues here in the House, like Mr. Roskam and my Senator, Mark Kirk, that we should increase sanctions, and that would give us a stronger negotiating stance and draw more concessions from Iran. The world needs to be a much safer place for all of us, and the only way to make that a safer place is to stop Iran's nuclear capabilities. And, Mr. Speaker, this deal does not do that. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks, and as he's approaching the microphone, let me just make one point, and that is something that Mr. Davis just highlighted. Sanctions are working. Sanctions have brought the Iranians to the table. So think of it this way, you know, you've got a hold of a pit bull and you've got it and it's a very dangerous animal and it's ferocious, and if you let go of it, it may come and attack you. Why in the world, if you've got it under control or some semblance of under control, why would you ever say, you know what, let's loosen our grip and try this again? It doesn't make any sense. I yield to the gentleman from Arizona.
Well, I certainly thank the gentleman. And, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that there are really two components to every threat in terms of national security that this country and other nations face. And that first component is that of intent. And the second is that of capacity. If one listens to the rhetoric that the Iranian leaders have spoken in recent years, the intent issue should be settled clearly in our minds. The question that remains is their capacity. And I would suggest to you, Mr. Speaker, that if indeed Iran gains a nuclear weapons capability, that the world will step into the shadow of nuclear terrorism. Terrorists the world over will have indirect access to nuclear weapons. And my children and those of the members in this body will face a forever future that is uncertain every step they take. Mr. Speaker, about 8 years ago, I stood here in this same spot and called for Iran to be referred to the Security Council. At that time, they had only 160 centrifuges, and of course, the call for them to be referred to the Security Council was diminished in that people said that they need 3,000 centrifuges for a full-blown nuclear weapons program. And today, Mr. Speaker, Iran has 19,000 centrifuges. And those centrifuges will continue to spend, most of them, under this agreement that the President has announced. This agreement the President has announced ignores not only U.S. law, but it ignores the UN sanctions that are in place. And it also ignores the fact that Iran has not made any concessions in this area in the last 30 years. It also ignores the position that this deal puts Israel in, one that is untenable and more impossible than any I've seen in my lifetime. The naivete of this administration in dealing with Iran is something that is simply breathtaking. Mr. Speaker, I would just suggest to you that if Iran gains nuclear weapons, we will need a new calendar. It will change our reality in the world that much. And I would say to you that while there's still time, we need to act. And you know, Mr. Speaker, there is that moment in the life of every problem when it is big enough to be seen and still small enough to be addressed. But in terms of Iran's nuclear weapons pursuit, that window is closing quickly. And whatever this body can do, whatever this President can do to prevent Iran from gaining a nuclear weapons capability must be done soon, because soon they will have the ability to ignore our entreaties, and only a military intervention would prevent it. And I would just say to you, Mr. Speaker, that whatever our cost is for preventing Iran from gaining nuclear weapons, it will pale in insignificance compared to the cost of allowing Iran to become a nuclear-armed nation. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's an amazing thing to think about how aggressive Iran has been without a nuclear weapon. That is a worldwide sponsor of terror, incredibly aggressive, going after and making threats about the Straits of Hormuz and so forth. Can you even imagine what it would be like as a nation if it had a nuclear a significant nuclear threat behind it? It would change the dynamic entirely. And I think one of the weaknesses of the administration's proposed deal is this: it puts the imprimatur of approval on enrichment. Up until now, it's been American policy that says you can't enrich. You have no right to a nuclear capability. And let's be frank, there's nobody with a straight face that's saying that the Iranians have any interest in pursuing nuclear technology because of an interest in global warming. You know, this is not an energy pursuit at all. It's clearly a pursuit to manipulate the world stage toward their ends that oftentimes are driven by terror. One of the great advocates of a strong U.S.-Israeli relationship and one of the great advocates of a strong U.S. foreign policy is the gentlelady from Florida, former chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, to whom I yield now, Ms. Ileana Ros-Lehtinen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank Mr. Roscom for his leadership in spearheading this discussion on the dangers of last month's interim nuclear agreement deal with Iran. As we've had more time to dissect this deal, it is becoming clearer and clearer that despite Secretary Kerry's claim that no deal is better than a bad deal, we've been had. In exchange for the one thing that Iran so desperately needs, sanctions relief to jumpstart its flailing economy, the administration received nothing more than window dressing to stop Iran's nuclear program. This interim deal is the unraveling of the sanctions policy that was so painstakingly crafted over the past 10 years, and it was aimed at bringing Iran's nuclear program to an end. We've already seen other nations eager to get back into the Iranian market, and it will now be nearly impossible to stop the cash infusion into the Iranian regime. How can we stop this? This deal is contrary to U.S. sanctions law. It is contrary to UN Security Council resolutions that explicitly prohibit Iran from being able to enrich its own uranium. By accepting this deal, the administration has acquiesced to Iran's illegitimate claim to a right to enrich uranium, and it has done nothing to dismantle the nuclear infrastructure of Iran. Any temporary pause in Iran's progress can now be easily started right up again, with no real detriment to Tehran's march toward nuclear weapons capability. The administration has struck a deal with an Iranian regime that is one of the world's biggest supporters of terrorism and is a U.S. designated state sponsor of terrorism. It has offered sanctions relief to the very same man who only 10 years ago, while serving as the chief nuclear negotiator of Iran to the West, boasted, Mr. Speaker, of using deception to buy time for Iran's nuclear program to progress. Yet the administration has fallen for what I called Rouhani's ruse. We have already seen Iran announce that it will continue construction on its plutonium plant at Arak, A-R-A-K, with some experts believing that Iran will exploit a possible loophole in the agreement to allow it to build important components of this heavy water reactor off-site. And we continue to see Iran make advances on other nuclear weapons programs not addressed in the interim agreement, such as the development of ballistic missile technology needed to launch a nuclear payload over long distances. Mr. Speaker, not only is this interim deal dangerous for the precedent that it sets, that rogue regimes will get rewarded at the expense of our friends and allies who do play by the rules, but the deal is also dangerous because it weakens our credibility and harms our relations with other countries. This sends a terrible message to other countries in the region that have long feared Iran becoming nuclear, but have refrained from seeking their own nuclear program because the United States had promised that we would not allow Iran to enrich uranium or complete its heavy water reactor. This deal will create a loss of trust from other regional allies such as Saudi Arabia and others who now see a double standard from the United States. Our closest friend and ally, the democratic Jewish state of Israel, continues to feel an existential threat from Iran. President Obama has weakened the trust and the credibility of the United States and in exchange has strengthened the legitimacy of the illegitimate Iranian regime. It is a double whammy. We lose stature while elevating a dangerous regime. And all for what? Our ability to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran and an all-out arms race in the Middle East. It's not going to happen. We're going to see a nuclear-armed Iran. We're going to see an all-out arms race in the Middle East, and we tarnished our relationship with our trusted allies. I remain committed, Mr. Speaker and Mr. Roscom, that ensuring that Iran never becomes a nuclear-capable country will happen. I urge my colleagues in the Senate to take up the sanctions legislation that we in the House overwhelmingly passed earlier this year. Mr. Speaker, Iran has no right whatsoever to enrichment. There can be no ambiguity here. The United States must not accept any new deal with Iran that does not end Iran's enrichment program completely and does not completely dismantle the nuclear infrastructure of this dangerous regime. I thank Mr. Roscom for this time. I thank him for his leadership, and we will continue the fight.
I thank the gentlelady. And at this time, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber.
I thank the gentleman from Illinois, our distinguished Deputy Whip. Mr. Speaker, this House disagrees on almost virtually every issue brought before it. However, this is one issue on which this House agrees. We all agree. We must never allow a nuclear-armed Iran. Repeatedly, this Congress has passed resolutions condemning a nuclear Iran, as well as multiple pieces of legislation strengthening an Iranian sanctions policy in the hopes of halting their progress. A number of resolutions calling for sanctions, increased scrutiny, and the cessation of enrichment have also passed the UN Security Council. And yet, instead of tightening the sanctions policy, a policy which has forced Iran to the negotiations table in the first place, this administration seems hell-bent on easing those sanctions and allowing the release of billions of dollars in assets and finances to Iran. Even more incredulous, we still don't have a finalized deal, much less know even the details of what they're planning. As a result of this administration's easement, Iran is already threatening an oil price war within OPEC, and companies around the world are jockeying to play in a country that still has no restrictions upon enrichment or upon nuclear weaponization. The terms of the so-called deal still under negotiation allow Iran to continue enrichment, directly violating multiple UN resolutions, directly violating U.S. stated policy, and directly violating international stated policy. The Institute for Science and International Security recently published a report indicating that Iran was a mere few months away from reaching that nuclear threshold. However, this administration's negotiations do nothing regarding dismantling systems obviously aimed at weaponization. They do nothing regarding the removal of uranium enriched beyond civilian needs. And they do nothing regarding work on delivery systems or ballistic missiles. And they do nothing to stop enrichment currently taking place. In essence, Iran has received everything they've wanted, and we've got nothing. Christmas has come early in Iran. The Iranian government, Mr. Speaker, is not to be trusted. It's been demonstrated time and time again. If we intend to keep our country safe and strong, we cannot grant concessions without first verifying behavioral changes from political unstable countries like Iran. We tried that tact, Mr. Speaker, in North Korea. How that's working for us? How's that been working for us? Members of Congress should refuse to stay silent on this issue. It is time for the Senate to step up to the plate and pass the Nuclear Iran Prevention Act. It is way past time for our administration and our negotiators to take a hard line stand against this evil. Here's a plan to do that. Let's demand some action. I'll give you 7 things. demand that Iran, number one, stops human rights violations and releases all political hostages, including Americans like Pastor Saeed Abedini, former U.S. Marine Amir Hekmati, and ex-FBI agent Robert Levinson. Number two, stop the exportation of terrorism and renounce terrorism. Number three, stop all the centrifuges, destroy them, and allow unlimited access from the IAEA. Number four, publicly apologize to America and Israel for calling them the large and small Satan. Number five, recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. Number six, withdraw from Syria. They want to prove that Iran is serious. And then finally, number seven, wait a year. Show the world they're serious. Perform those 6 functions. We want action, Mr. Speaker, not promises. As former Senator Phil Gramm once stated, if the lamb is going to lie down with the lion, we want America to be the lion. We want to use our strength, show our strength, negotiate from a position of strength. To do anything else may make Israel the sacrificial lamb. This current administration needs to understand that this deal is a bad deal. I'm Randy Weber. There you have it. Thank you.
Well, I thank the gentleman for his insight and his perspective and his admonition for action. And at this point, I'd like to yield to the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Wilarski, a member of the Armed Services Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Roscom, and thanks for your leadership on the issue and the opportunity to speak about this issue tonight. And thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his State of the Union address on January 24, 2012, President Barack Obama said, "Let there be no doubt America is determined to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and I will take no options off the table to achieve that goal." On March 4, 2012, President Obama again stated his desire to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran. He said, "Iran's leaders should understand that I do not have a policy of containment. I have a policy to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon." On October 22, 2012, President Obama said of Iran, "The clock is ticking, and we're going to make sure that if they do not meet the demands of the international community, then we're going to take all options necessary to make sure they don't have a nuclear weapon." 14 months later, the clock is still ticking, and Iran is now closer to acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. Now that the world leaders have reached an interim agreement on Iran's illegal nuclear program, we must be able to verify compliance and demand that any final deal completely dismantle Tehran's existing nuclear program. There are 3 reasons why this is imperative and for the international community to demand the suspension of nuclear enrichment. First, Tehran must stop all enrichment activities because Iran is in noncompliance with the highest form of international law. Iran is in direct violation of mandatory UN Security Council resolutions demanding them to suspend all enrichment and reprocessing. By not requiring Iran to abide by multiple UN resolutions, we are rewarding bad behavior. We're signaling to the entire world that we are not serious about preventing the spread of nuclear weaponry. Second, a nuclear-armed Iran threatens our national security. The threat of a nuclear-armed Iran is not something that is just talked about in the halls of this Congress. Every time I'm home, I hear the fears of Hoosiers who worry about how acts of terrorism might impact gas prices, food prices, and the well-being of loved ones. Since 1984, our government has designated Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism. The State Department has characterized Iran as the most active state sponsor of terrorism in the world. Iran has provided weapons, training, and funding to terrorist groups, including Hamas, Hezbollah, and Shiite militias in Iraq, who are responsible for the murder of hundreds of U.S. service members and innocent civilians. Third, a nuclear-armed Iran threatens to further destabilize an already volatile region. If Iran is allowed to further pursue its nuclear ambitions, the region highlighted by perpetual conflict in places like Iraq, Syria, Yemen, will become more destabilized. Furthermore, a nuclear-armed Iran will jeopardize the safety of our allies and partners in the region, like Israel. I believe now more than ever, the United States must renew our unbreakable commitment to Israel and her inherent right to self-defense. Iran's continued violation of UN and International Atomic Energy Agency restrictions have only given the world good reason to question Iran's willingness to abide by any future international agreement. Mr. Roscoe and Mr. Speaker, I call on the President to remember his words to the American people about preventing Tehran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And I urge the President to use all tools at his disposal, including additional sanctions, to persuade Iran from developing nuclear weapons. Thank you, and I yield back my time. Mr. Roscoe, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wilarski, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this point, I'd like to yield to the gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Bachmann, a member of the House Intelligence Committee.
Mr. Speaker, I want to say thank you to my colleague Peter Roskam, who we came in together when we won our election in 2006. It's been a privilege to serve with Mr. Roskam, who is not only the head and co-chair of the Israel Caucus, but also a strong defender of a strong United States national security posture, one that has helped to lead the world into safety for decades, and one that we continue to maintain for the benefit of the American people. You see, this is a very interesting time that we're in. We have virtually watched the hinge of history turn just in the events of these last several weeks. Why do I say that? I say that because the Obama administration and the negotiators of the Obama administration have entered into a deal that could effectively guarantee that Iran will obtain the certainty of a nuclear weapon. Now, I know that it is the stated intention of the Obama administration that just the opposite of that will happen. But there is a big difference between theory and intention and the outcome of the result. Today, we listened to members from the Obama administration and members of the negotiating team from the Obama administration, and they seem quite convinced in the theory of stopping Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And the theory goes something like this. It says that we believe that Iran has the capacity to continue to enrich uranium and do it for a peaceful purpose. They believe that it's possible to verify that Iran would do that. But what about the reality? What's the reality of what the supreme leader of Iran has said their intentions are with this program? Just prior to the signing of the agreement, the Supreme Leader was not vague. He was quite clear. He gave a speech on Press TV. He wanted the world to know what his intentions were. And he gave a speech in front of tens of thousands of paramilitary troops in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And he said that it will be Iran's position that we will not change, in his words, our nuclear program one iota. So apparently, according to the Supreme Leader, the program as Iran has originally envisioned it will go on. It will go on at the same pace that it was going on before, without any change in his word. Once the agreement was struck, there was a real question. And the question was this: will Iran maintain the indigenous inherent quote-unquote right to enrich uranium? You see, that's the whole ball game, Mr. Speaker. Will Iran have the right to enrich uranium? What do you need to build a nuclear weapon? You need fuel for that weapon, whether it's plutonium or whether it's uranium. Well, Iran wants to make sure that they achieve the goal. So they're engaging both in developing plutonium and uranium. They have a heavy water reactor, the Arak facility, and the Arak facility is under construction. We have a 6-month interim agreement where we're supposed to get to a final negotiation. The plutonium facility is not built yet, but it's under construction. One of those items is building a road to the reactor. That road continues to be built. There is no effort to stop that from being done. And there is virtually no way for us to be able to stop mobile components from being built elsewhere and eventually brought into the heavy water reactor for the plutonium site. That's an issue. That's a big issue. And the other one being enrichment. We know today that Iran has something like 19,000 centrifuges. A minimum 10,000 of those centrifuges are spinning. So much so that the estimate is they have somewhere between 9 and 10 tons of enriched uranium. If we were serious about stopping Iran from creating a nuclear weapon, there's several simple things we would do. We would make sure that Iran would shut down the heavy water plutonium reactor, and we would make sure that Iran would dismantle, take a sledgehammer to the centrifuges. Gone. That hasn't happened. Not to one. The centrifuges remain. So if you have centrifuges enriching, if you have enriched uranium, if you are continuing to enrich, I'd say you've got a program. Now, this is very interesting because we just concluded a negotiation. From my experience as a former federal tax litigation attorney, I did a lot of negotiating. Usually when two sides are negotiating, they do it for a reason. And the reason is because they want to be better off, both parties, they want to be better off based upon the agreement that they negotiated. Now, it seems to me something happened along the way during this negotiation. It makes me wonder if the Obama administration negotiators forgot which side they were negotiating for. Now, why do I say that? I say that because take a look at what Iran got out of the deal. And I want to give full attribution to Illinois Senator Mark Kirk, who created this terrific graphic. And this is what Senator Kirk lets us know about the agreement. What we are getting out of the deal are 0 centrifuges dismantled. These are the machines that create the fuel for a nuclear weapon. Not one will be dismantled out of 19,000. 0 uranium of the 9 to 10 tons will be shipped out of Iran. So the material remains in Iran. The ability to continue to create more material remains in Iran. Looks like a pretty good get for Iran. 0 nuclear facilities are closed. We know that there's even more than we thought originally. There's Natanz, there's Fordo, Parchin, and the plutonium reactor at Iraq, and let alone other covert programs we're not aware of. There's also no delay on the plutonium reactor. In fact, the Supreme Leader in Iran made it abundantly clear. They said, we read the agreement to say that we are not going to stop any construction on the plutonium reactor. I would say that's a violation of the agreement right there. What's been the reaction of the Obama administration? What's been the reaction of the negotiators? Do they have egg on their faces? Do they look a little foolish from this agreement that they struck? We haven't heard anything from the current negotiators. There's also no stop in the missile testing. So if Iran has a nuclear weapon, if they have the fuel for a nuclear weapon, and if they have the capability to deliver that weapon through missile testing, I'd say they've got something. There's also no stop in terrorism from Iran, and there's no stop in human rights abuses. Many Americans aren't aware that there are Americans who are being held hostage today in Iran. When Ronald Reagan dealt with the Soviet Union to try to end the Cold War, Ronald Reagan handed the Soviets a list of dissidents that he wanted freed in order for him to begin these talks with the Soviet Union. He sent a signal to the Soviet Union. It said, in America, we believe every American life counts. That sent a very strong message. In the case of the Obama administration negotiators, they didn't even bring it up. They didn't demand that one American be released before we talk. Now, this is interesting because the Obama administration put a lot of pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. And he said, you, Mr. Prime Minister, have to agree to release over 100 murderous thugs, including murderers who murdered an American, before the Palestinians will come to the table to negotiate with you on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That was our president who put pressure under the Prime Minister. You've got to release thugs in order to negotiate. We would put that kind of pressure on Israel, and we wouldn't put that kind of pressure on Iran? You see, that's why, Mr. Speaker, I asked the question. Did the negotiators forget which nation they were negotiating for? Because it looks to me like the score is pretty clear. United States 0, Iran made out on the deal. The sad thing about that final score, and let's hope it's not the final score, is that, again, the hinge of history turns. And if you have an Iran with a nuclear weapon, it won't be just Iran. You will explode proliferation. Saudi Arabia will have a nuclear weapon. Egypt will have a nuclear weapon. We will have a nuclear weapon most likely in Lebanon. And then at that point, what will happen with terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, the Al-Nusra Front, and on from there. The world changes. The hinge of history turns. And that's why this isn't political. That's why it is bipartisan here tonight. It's why Mr. Roskam has taken this very important, courageous step of holding this time when members of Congress can weigh in. Because we aren't about bashing the Obama administration. That's not why we're here. We're here because we believe in national security. America's national security. Israel's national security. And peace across the world. That's Pax Americana. America doing everything that we can to be forward of keeping the peace in the world. This action nearly guarantees war and a threatened nuclear strike. We can prevent that. But the final deal that comes out in these final P5+1 negotiations must be very simple. Close down the plutonium reactor, zero right to enrich for Iran, and zero processing. If you do that, then we'll have a deal. And I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, we've had a discussion tonight that has been incredibly robust. It has been bipartisan. We've had insight from members of the Intelligence Committee, the Armed Services Committee, members who have had a long-time interest in Middle Eastern